Hello everyone, my name's Nigel, and whilst I can't be with you guys tonight, I'm going to do the next best thing and pre-record a quick sampler of how to use Blender with Unreal Engine. So firstly, big thank you to our sponsors to making this all possible. And the goal tonight is that we're just going to have a really quick start into looking how Blender can be used to create assets for Unreal Engine. So the goal is we're going to show some of how the process was done to create the crate that's currently sitting in the GitHub repository and as an asset within Dissension. So basically we're going to go very quickly through Blender, how to use Blender, how to create an object in Blender, export it out, quickly texture it. I won't spend too much time on that, but import it into the Unreal Engine and have it inside your game. I don't assume any prior knowledge, but I'm not giving you an explanation of step by step. I'm going to give you the quick 20,000 foot flyover. This is how it works, just to show you the steps involved. There are heaps of resources on the internet you can go to learn Blender, and the best place to start is by downloading Blender itself. So basically just go to www.blender.org/download and grab it for either Mac, Linux or Windows or any other variety of software you've got. And once you open it up, you'll be presented with something much like this screen. It is worth noting, Blender is a very complicated piece of software. It's actually multiple pieces of software in one. It can handle video sequencing editing, it can handle animation, geometry asset creation, movies, even an internal game engine. So there's a lot to be dealt with in the user interface. That's why when you open it up, you're presented with just a plethora of buttons, widgets, tools. It's going to be overwhelming for you the very first time you see it. But persevere, stick with it, go to Google, watch basic tutorials, look at how you can quickly start things, look at other people, how they've done it. Basically, just be a sponge, learn. Try and get over that learning curve hurdle really quickly. It will take a while. It will take you investing into it. But once you've done it, you'll have a really powerful base to create 3D assets with, because you're learning some really powerful software. So if you want to create a static image, you want to render a little movie, or you want to create an asset for Unreal Engine, or even if you want to create something for a 3D printer, it can all be done in Blender. So, assuming that we don't know anything about geometry and meshes and objects and 3D assets, basically, what is a mesh? Well, every 3D model in a game is a series of little triangles or squares that are stitched together to enclose a space and create a shape and create the mesh or the model. Basically, you can see here in this dolphin diagram that if you look closely enough at these items in a computer game, you'll find they're decomposed or composed of little triangles or little squares, actually rectangles. Here you can see in this diagram that I've taken from Wikipedia that each object, the object at the right being the cube, is made up of smaller and smaller components. And on the far left we have vertices. Vertices are just a point in space, but they're a point in 3D space. If you're familiar with graph paper and putting a two-dimensional point on a graph paper, knowing that it's x coordinate and it's y coordinate, if you added a depth coordinate, how far deep into the page that object, that point was going, you would end up with an xy coordinate and a z coordinate, which would give you a vertice, which can be a point in space. Those dots on the image here you see are basically the very fundamental building block of geometry that we use in computer games. So you can see that vertices, when you combine two vertices together, you'll get an edge, which is just a line. When you combine three vertices together, you'll have three lines, and when you join those up, you'll end up with a triangle, and a triangle is the face. What we also call tris, or the polygon. Polygons can have any number of edges to them. So if you're using quads, you can build those up, and then you can see you can match those, stitch those together to make surfaces, which when they're all stitched together will end up with the shape that you've created. Blender lets you control your modeling at any one of these levels. You can move whole objects around, you can move the face around of something you've selected, you can move an edge around, or you can go right down to the vertice and move the vertices individually. So the journey here, we start with what is a very basic cube inside Blender. We manipulate that, we change its shape slightly, we produce the shape we want. We'll then do some quick UV editing, so to create the map for the textures to be applied to the 3D shape. Textures come in 2 dimensions, shapes come in 3 dimensions. So we've got to come up with a UV map, which is much like an XY coordinate system, but we call it UV because it's for texturing. Feel free to Google that if that's new to you. And we'll end up with applying a texture to the 3D model to produce the object, the crate on the right. So, we've just mentioned that the user interface for Blender is extremely complicated, and it will be overwhelming to you when you first encounter it. Persevere, that's my tip. We are only going to scratch the very surface in this quick start, in this quick overview, and I've just listed a few items of the things that we're doing to make sure that we can get an object into Unreal. When it comes to 3D modeling, this is more of a general comment, whether it's Blender or any other product. You won't have a process that goes from the very beginning to the very end in mind when you start. You will start with a simple object and you'll add geometry to it. You will start with something that resembles, like this cube resembles a crate, and how you're going to change it, each facet of it, to become the crate you want. If you want to create a dragon, you might start with not a cube but a cylinder, and then you'll shape it. You'll shape the head and you'll shape the tail and you'll add some other cylinders to make legs, etc. So you end up with a series of small tactical pathways. You plan tactically inside a larger strategy. To create the crate here, I used a whole series of different tactics. So when I wanted to, I had a cube. When I wanted to make an edge round, I would adjust that edge and make it round. Then I would add a bit of geometry in the corners to round those corners off. Then I would add geometry to divot or depress a section of some of the faces, so that's where straps would lock down the crate. I've also used a whole bunch of different techniques and different tactics when it came to making changes to the underlying geometry to get it to where I wanted it to be. You can see on this slide here some of those things. Sometimes I would join geometry together, sometimes I would split geometry apart, sometimes I would add geometry, sometimes I would simplify it. And when I say geometry there, I mean the vertices. I needed to add vertices to smooth something out where it was forming a hard edge. I needed it to have a smoother edge, so I needed to multiply the number of vertices that actually supported the model. That's just to give you a flavour of how you approach 3D modelling. Everyone does it slightly differently. This is just about making sure you understand it's not one monolithic process, it's a series of small steps. And when you're modelling something like this crate, you'll take some steps, you'll go forward, sometimes you might want to go back because you don't like the way those steps panned out. But you end up having a series of tactical approaches and plans which form a broader strategy. And finally, we're going to show you how to export an object out of Blender into Unreal Engine. It's been made very easy. Epic has actually supported the export of items out of Blender. They financially supported the exporter, so we can use our FBX files really easily in Unreal. Okay, so when you open up Blender, you're going to be presented with this kind of a screen, and lots of different buttons. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, but basically I will just bring you very quickly along the journey of how we start from a cube and we end up with a crate. So you'll see down here, every time I touch a key or the mouse, you'll see this icon change to show you what I've done. And I'll call them out. So basically we start with this cube. It's already selected in the orange here, and if I hit tab, I go into the edit mode, and you can see these are the vertices. If I use my right mouse button, these vertices here make up the cube. If I select a vertex and I hit the G to grab, I can move my mouse around and I can change the shape of this geometry. I can also do it when I use the shift and the right mouse button to select multiple vertices. I automatically select an edge here, and another edge, and another edge, and now I've selected enough edges, I've actually selected the whole face. Again, if I hit the G key, it will move around, and I've changed the underlying geometry of our object. Now, when it comes to Blender and Unreal, Blender has a series of units. Blender's scale is just an arbitrary scale, and you can see here this grid. This represents one Blender unit. Luckily, when the exporter is run, it will actually export one Blender unit to 1 meter in Unreal. So if I want an archway that has to have a gap of 3 meters and be 4 meters up, tall up, the gap will have to be 3 blender units here with an overall height of 4 blender units. So what I'm going to do is use Shift and the middle mouse button to pan around, middle mouse button to move the camera view. Then I'm going to use a number pad, which allows me to quickly move between views. I'm going to look at the front, and I'm going to use the middle mouse, the number 5 on the keypad to make an orthogonal view. That's without perspective. Using Shift and middle mouse button, drag it to the center. Then I'm going to hit Z to make sure that I can see through my geometry to the vertices I need. A to deselect everything. A toggles between selecting everything and deselecting everything. With everything deselected, I want to use B and drag out over the bottom of my cube here to select all the bottom vertices and therefore the face, and use G to bring that up to this green line which represents 0. How do I know this? I've used N to turn on this properties toolbox. If I scroll up to the top here, this transform section, you can see here that the coordinates are represented in these 3 boxes. With those vertices selected in G, I can move up and down, and you can see using the middle mouse button to constrain the axis to up and down, that I'm changing the Z value of these vertices. So if I make them 0 there, that means this is sitting on the ground. I then want to use B, just like the top vertices, and make sure that they are sitting at exactly 1 blender unit. That will be 1 meter above 1 meter in Unreal. So now we're looking at a box that is 1 meter tall but 2 meters wide, and if I use my middle mouse button to drag around, it's also 2 meters deep. We want to fix that, so I'm going to hit 7 on the number pad to take the top view. I'm going to use B to select all of these vertices on the left hand side, G to move them across. Now it lets me move them in any direction, so whilst I've moved it in the direction I want, I'm going to hit the middle mouse button to constrain it to that axis. Then I'm going to hit the control key and hold control to snap that to my grid to make sure that I'm snapping to 0. And you can see as I move that left and right, that up on the top right there, the X value of those vertices is being manipulated. So I'm just going to hit escape to let it reset. You can see now that X up here is at 0. I can click on that and set any new value I want. So I can click on it, hit 0, it is 0. Using A to deselect all the vertices, and using B again to select these vertices here. I'm going to use G to drag them up, and Control to constrain that to clip it to my grid, and then click where I want to be. And now I've got, you can see here I was manipulating the Y value. Y is at 0. So using Shift and middle mouse button, and then mouse button to move around, you can see we're looking now at a cube that is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter in Unreal Engine terms. This is pretty good. If we hit Z, you can see, and then A to deselect, and then Tab to move us back to object mode, you can see that a solid cube is presented to us. So hitting Tab gets us back to edit mode, hitting Z takes us back into a wireframe view. What I want to do now is add a little bit of complexity to this cube. So what I'm going to do down the bottom here is select the Edge Select tool, and I'm going to use my right mouse button to select, right mouse button and Shift to select the top face and the bottom face. Effectively, I've selected 2 faces and those edges associated with the face. What I'm trying to do now is to smooth out and round off those edges. Blender has a whole bunch of tools you can use for a whole bunch of different reasons, and the fastest way to access them, rather than drilling through each of these menus on the side here, is to just press the spacebar and type what you would like. So in this instance, I'm going to use the Bevel Tool, which it also presents the shortcut key over here as Control B. If I click on Bevel, now as I move my mouse around, it's actually beveling those edges that I'd selected. I'm going to use the mouse wheel to add in extra geometry, which allows those edges to now be smoothed many times. And I move my mouse roughly to where I'd like it to be, I adjust it accordingly, and I then click my mouse button to select that option, that tool is now committed, and I'll hit Z to show the object. We've now got our cube with a bit more, with more interesting edges to it. That's starting to look a bit more like a crate than a cube. Now what I'm going to do is make sure I go back to select it with my right mouse button, hit Tab, and I'm going now to select the whole faces at a time. You can see little black dots appear in the middle of the faces. I can use my right mouse button to select one, I can use right mouse button and Shift key to select multiple faces at the same time. Hitting A to deselect all of them. I'm going to select the very top one here, and what I want to do is move that face downwards, but add geometry so that it actually makes a cutout, like a divot. It makes a gap. So if I just move it, I can hit G, I'll just move this around. But I don't want to do just that, so I'm going to actually extrude it. So I'm going to hit E, and then move that downwards. You can see it's creating like a lip edge to where I'm creating it. It's adding the geometry to connect my face that's moving to the previous geometry. So I'm just going to select where I want it there. Excellent. Now if I hit Z and Tab and Z, you can see, and I'll put perspective back on, we're looking at something that looks a little bit more like a cube, sorry, a crate than the cube we started with. And we can do some similar stuff to these side ones here. If we wanted to, we could start playing with every facet of this. We can select geometry, we can select edges, we can select individual vertices and move those around if we needed to. In effect, we've got ourselves a basic crate-like substance. We could apply a texture to that and put it in game. So I'm going to hit Tab and move that back to selecting this whole object. And now I'm going to export this geometry. Basically take it out of Blender, throw it into a file in a file format that Unreal Engine can consume. So with that selected, I'm going to go up to File, Export, FBX, that's the file format we can use, and select a location on my hard drive. And up here select a name for it, just type in the name you'd like, and most importantly down the bottom left here, make sure that you click in the Export FBX options, selected objects, so that it'll only export those that are selected. So if you've got multiple objects, which I often do, but I only want to pull one out, that's how I do it. All the other default settings are okay to leave as they are. And go to the top right, hit Export FBX. Straight away, it returns you back to this screen. If there was an error, or if it was a very complex model that was taking a while to process, you would see up the very top here, next to this little orange icon, a progress bar or the error messages displayed for you. If we show the section of the hard drive now, you can see that demo crate has been created, and it's a very small file because it's just the geometry. What I'm going to do is show how we can now import that into Unreal by just clicking that file, dragging into the content browser where we'd like. Or not. Okay, it's picked it up. And here we have the FBX import options. It's not a skeletal mesh, so we don't choose that option. We can leave the rest of the defaults the same. Import all. It's going to give us some errors because we haven't done a couple of things, but in very basic terms, I can now drag this object into Unreal, and where is it? There it is. There is our cube. Sorry, our crate inside Unreal. If we open up that asset, we can find it is indeed a normal model. There's all the detail that we put into it, and we can show the collision boundaries, etc. So we can actually interact with it, we can put physics on it so we can knock it over or it can knock us over. So, nice plain cube. All the geometry we had in Blender is in here, but it's a bit plain looking. So what I'm really quickly going to do is go back into Blender and drag out another view, same view there, change it to the UV editor, which is how we texture objects. So X and Y is the coordinates for positions in 2 dimensions. UV is what we just name when we're trying to do a texture map, because textures come in 2 dimensions and objects come in 3 dimensions, and we've got to map those together. With the 3-dimensional object selected, go into Tab, select all the faces, because we map individual faces to their texture. And over on the left hand side here, where we've got shading / UVs, we can go down and unwrap this. You can see on the right hand side, these are the faces, so I will now select by face. As I select individual faces, you can see they are appearing in this 2-dimensional map. Now we need to put some colors on the 2-dimensional map and then map those back together, combine those back in the game engine. So we've now, if we select all faces, we can see all faces are represented on the UV map, which is how Unreal knows to map 2-dimensional textures to 3-dimensional objects. So we will just go back to tab, so we've selected the object. We'll now go file export again, so it's file export FBX. Select the same file again, we don't have to type a new name, it'll just write over the top of it. The selected object, we go up export it again, and we can now go back to Unreal. Sorry, we won't go to Unreal first, we'll go to another product called Substance Painter. Very quickly, just to show you that we can. I won't go into this at all, there's other demonstrations, but you can see that our object is now in this particular program. What I'm going to do is apply computer texture. It's not going to look right just yet until I bake. Bear with me whilst we just do some calculations. This is just one way of making a texture. We could have an image of something else and put it on there. But effectively, we've created this texture for this crate object. Don't worry too much about what exactly I'm doing here. I'm just generating some colors for it, so that we have something a bit more useful to look at inside Unreal Engine. So, going back to Unreal, I now need to import a whole series of our textures. So I've created 3 image files, which I'll put next to the object in the content browser, just by dragging them over from Windows Explorer. It's just importing them now. And I will create a material. I'll open this up in the material editor. I need to drag some other channels into this material. If you're not familiar with this, don't worry too much about it. It's a fairly easy process to learn, a repeatable process. But just make sure we're looking at something a little bit more interesting than a flat white shaded cube, effectively. You can see here that UV texture mapping is repeated again in this object view. Just got to do one more manipulation to make sure everything works correctly. Now, in Unreal Engine, created this material called m_demo_crate, so it's going to apply that to it. Right, what I haven't done is actually export the thing again. I need to, so we've applied the material, but the UV maps haven't been re-imported, so right hand clicking on 3-dimensional geometry, click re-import, and there you go. It's re-imported the UV map. It's re-imported the whole object, including the UV maps that we created. And here we are in Unreal with our object. You can apply physics to it, it's got collision, you can apply collision to it, see there, it's got the map, it's come from Blender, so you can see you are limited only by your knowledge of Blender and your creativity. You now have a new crate in the game. Thanks everyone, I hope that's been useful. As I say, Blender itself is a huge topic. It's a very powerful tool. There's heaps of information available on the internet for you to go and look at. It's a very powerful tool for Unreal and a whole bunch of other things, but here it is. Here I wanted to show you just quickly how you can use it to get assets into the game, and as your knowledge of Blender increases, the quality of your assets in Unreal will work. The beautiful part about it is Blender itself is open source. The other program I use to texture it is not open source. That's Substance Painter. That costs money. But Blender is free, Unreal is free, and you've got yourself some very powerful tools at your disposal for no cost. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.